Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to this event as part of Real-Time Constraints, which is arebyte Gallery's current exhibition, which takes the form of a browser plugin. So the exhibition is a group show. It has works by Gretchen Andrew, Jake Elwes, Joel Simon, Ben Grosser, Libby Disnovation, sorry, my bad. And the works reveal themselves over a series of pop-ups and are disseminated over the period of a normal working day. So every hour a work will interrupt your screen and pop up in front of everything else that you have open. It's quite an experimental exhibition for us. But if you haven't yet downloaded it and tried it, please feel free to do so. You can head to the Chrome or Firefox web stores and just search real-time constraints, or you can just click on the link that I'll add into the YouTube chat box. It will just take a couple of seconds to install. So yeah, you can give that a go whilst we're doing the panel discussion if you like. So I just want to say thanks to Rob Pruce again for programming the plugin, and also to Arts Council England for supporting the exhibition. My name's Rebecca, I'm the curator here at arebyte, and yeah, so I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel. We'll be talking with some of the artists from the exhibition. I'll just see if I can name them so they can give a wave. So we've got Gretchen Andrew, we've got Joel Simon, we've got Jake Elwes, and we've got Ben Grosser here, and Sofia Crespo is just about to join us as well. And yeah, so we're going to be discussing bias in data sets, the origins of AI technologies, privacy and surveillance, and how we might bring about change in the AI industry. We'll be live streaming this to YouTube, as you can see, and I invite you to ask questions. So feel free to pop them in the YouTube chat or direct message arebyte on Instagram, because I'll be checking that throughout. Cool, yeah, so thanks for joining, and I'll pass over to Luba now. So Luba Elliott will be moderating this panel discussion. All right.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So I'm really delighted to have been invited to co-curate the Real-Time Constraints exhibition, and now to moderate this discussion with some of our artists around AI. And in terms of me and my work, I'm a curator and researcher specializing in AI in the creative fields. And so I frequently work with the technology community to promote the latest research and explore the opportunities of using that creatively. And I also curate various exhibitions, including AI artists, to try and showcase to the world what's happening with these AI technologies. And I'm very much interested in organizing exhibitions kind of outside the White Cube Gallery. So I frequently do shows at conferences, at academic events, also in public spaces with my Art and AI Festival in Leicester. And with arebyte, it's been really interesting to do an exhibition online as a plugin, and that's a first for me. So in terms of this panel discussion, I think the way we'll proceed is that I'll ask each of the artists to introduce themselves, and then maybe they could talk a little bit about their work, and particularly in relation to AI. And then we've got a list of questions that we can sort of start off with for the discussion. And if you, the viewers and listeners, have any questions that you would like to ask, as Rebecca mentioned, add them on YouTube or write to arebyte on Instagram. And at this point, maybe if we could start with all the artists giving an introduction. Who would like to go first? Maybe Ben? You're next to me on the video screen, so maybe you'd like to start.
Thanks, Luba. Yeah, the order, how we end up ordered on Zoom, I think could probably be utilized to make some kind of artwork. The way everyone gets a different order. Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be a part of this exhibition. I appreciate all the work that arebyte and Luba have done to make this possible. Yeah, just briefly, in terms of AI as a subject and a method in my own work, I've used it for various projects in the past and have unfinished current projects going on now, but includes work called Interactive Robotic Painting Machine, which is an artificially intelligent robot that makes paintings using oil on canvas and listens to its environment as input into the process. I have a work called Computers Watching Movies that shows what a computational system sees when it watches the same films that we do, and it sketches in response to them. Currently working on an autonomous video artist robot that drives around and captures video and analyzes it and makes its own video artworks. So in terms of a method, I use it in a variety of projects, but certainly data and algorithms, which is kind of the focus of the work I have in the exhibition, is a constant subject for me. So just thinking critically about what kind of data is getting collected, how is it being used, what's the role of art in revealing the ways in which algorithms and networks and software constructs users to be providers of data to systems. So that's just a little bit, and I'm excited to talk about the questions and hear from my colleagues in the chat here.
Who'd like to go next? Maybe Sofia, because again, you're the next artist I see on my screen.
Yeah, okay, here we go. So, yeah, so I'm a generative artist and I work with neural networks, and my work, and well, our work, I'll let Doug Fractures introduce himself, but our work is around nature and how we can use machine learning to help us see patterns in nature. That is like extracting patterns from the world around us and re-evaluate them using these technologies. So it attempts to, well, in my previous projects like Neural Zoo and Artificial Remnants, which is the project that we showed on arebyte, which is part of the online experience, we try to recreate life forms that don't exist. And we did that by, in this case, using a GAN that's trained on 3D data and that generate 3D models of insects in this case. And we use like other algorithms to generate biological and anatomical descriptions about them and to generate textures for the 3D meshes. And yeah,
I think that covers it pretty well. I won't really go so much into the project. Sofia has really said it all, but I'm Dark Fractures and I work as an artist and more now working with AI and generative arts. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. So, thank you.
Okay, who's next? Maybe Joel?
Hello, yes. I'm Joel. Very happy to be here as part of this project. It's very cool. So a little bit about me. Most of my work is focused on the role of computation, or I guess like techniques from computation and concepts and systems from biology in the creative process and also in my sculpture. And so for the creative process, I'm interested in learning from when humans have been able to kind of transcend their own limitations. So I'm interested in like the breeding process as a collaborative design process. And so ArtBreeder was a tool I made inspired by that. And so it uses machine learning as a vehicle to foster a kind of a large collaborative system. So taking a systems approach to the creative process. And I also use it in sculptures recently. I was interested in understanding, I guess, looking at the poetics of the metaphors used in machine learning, of these different agents, adversarial relationships. So I did a sculpture kind of based off the relationships of different networks recently. So those are some of the ways I use machine learning in my work.
Great, thanks, Joel. Gretchen?
Hello, I'm Gretchen Andrew. Also really excited to be with these fellow artists and Luba and arebyte. Really cool project to be part of, especially in its delivery. And I'm really also glad that Joel just introduced the idea of poetics. So what I do in my practice with machine learning is, instead of doing something generative, I look at what AI is educated on and how anyone can some of those AI systems, anyone can get involved and re-educate them based on whatever they feel like. Like, they're not locked data sets a lot of the time, especially within Google and social media. By creating content, you can actually modify the education that AI is getting. And poetically, to Joel's word here, I look at the fact that the internet and artificial intelligence can't parse desire. It doesn't know the difference between having something and wanting something. And I play in that area by looking at hacking my way into data sets that train Google's AI about like what success in the art world looks like, the fact that I'm now, according to Google, very, very successful. And specifically for this project, I looked at the search, the next American president, and programmed my physical in real life vision boards that express my hopes for the next American president, such that they've pushed out Donald Trump and every other political candidate from the search, the next American president. And in doing so, have changed the machine learning around what a president can look like, caused some red flags to come up about what, like, if I can do this, we should all be really terrified. And then also really have taken AI as something that's very backwards looking on data that already does exist, and make it possible to program the future, or the future that we want, into the brains of AI.
Thank you, Gretchen. So I believe now it's your turn, Jake.
Hey, I'm Jake. I'm a London-based artist, and I've been using machine learning for, I guess, the last 5 years. Very much kind of supported by Luba along the way. We've been doing a lot of shows together. I guess I'm quite interested in what sort of dialogues you can set up using machine learning and what you can say about it. And I guess setting up relationships by taking it into different environments. And a work that I did recently was taking marsh birds out into the marsh that were being generated using machine learning. And they were like out in having this kind of conversation with the environment and the real life birds. The most recent project I've been working on is kind of looking more at the politics of the data sets and looking at deepfake technology and generative technology, and thinking about, well, I guess a few of my works, I've looked at kind of standardized data sets and maybe the limits of the biases, and kind of what if you get two different models have conversations with each other and it starts to kind of show the limitations. Recently, I've been thinking about deep fakes and how it's often presented in this kind of dystopic, often white cis men, being the subject of the deep fake. So I was interested in this idea of kind of querying the data and thinking about what if I were to take machine learning into a performative context. So I've collaborated with a group of drag performers in London, and we're building sort of deep fake bodies of drag performers at the moment. The piece that I'm showing is a piece where I've injected 1,000 faces of drag performers into a standardized data set, FFHQ, which is again gathered mostly by Americans, taken from open source imagery, and contains, quite homogenous images of faces, and isn't particularly good at recognizing women of color or trans people. So I'm using kind of drag as a way of disrupting this process and kind of shifting all the weights in the neural network from what it was into a otherness. And, you know, drag being something that challenges gender. So using drag kings, drag queens, just people who are really interested in kind of gender queerness and otherness. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. And thanks everyone. It was really interesting to hear more about your recent projects and yeah, what you're doing with AI and machine learning. And to start off our discussion, I was actually wondering what inspired each of you to start working with machine learning technologies? Because of course, as artists, nowadays you have so many different tools and mediums that you can work with, but many of you do regularly work with machine learning as a core in your practice. So I was curious as to kind of what inspired you to start working with AI and with the data sources that you've been selecting.
Should I just
volunteer? Maybe you, Jake.
I guess for me, well, actually, the first thing was Gene Kogan, who's an amazing educator who I met in Berlin, and he kind of introduced me to this field. I think maybe some of the others, you kind of have come across Gene, and Rebecca Fibrink, another wonderful memo actin. There are a few people who really inspired me kind of in the early days and introduced me to some of these things. But I guess for me, coming from a fine art background, I was really interested in sort of generative art and using code. But then when I started to look into machine learning, I kind of realized the implications and just how large a field it is. And, you know, talking of artificial intelligence as a wider subject, so I kind of use AI as a way of encompassing the politics and the ethics, as well as machine learning, kind of the cold tools that you use. I think there's just so much fruit ripe for the picking. And I think it's really important in a way that artists are joining into this conversation and getting other people to, I don't know, getting more and more people involved in these discussions.
I'll jump in because I really think there's a lot of resonance between what Jake does and what I do with the modifying of the data sets. And I love that you brought up otherness when you spoke about your practice and your introduction, because to me, like, as coming from a painting background, the idea of why we as humans value art and what that can mean as an education for machines is really interesting to me. The origins of AI in my practice were actually more of a byproduct. I was manipulating search engines, manipulating search results, and quickly realized that this actually is doing very much what Jake is doing. It's modifying a data set that AI is learning based of. It's injecting otherness. It's doing the same thing it does for our own brains when we look at art. And that kind of just led me, with Luba's assistance or support, like, to be thinking more and more about my work in the AI context.
I could go. I got my start using AI in an art context before deep learning emerged. So I kind of started around 2010. And so for me at that time, it was, I mean, neural networks, of course, were around, but they weren't computationally something that was useful for most people. Hadn't exploded into the deep learning thing it is now. So I got my start with genetic algorithms. It's kind of how I started working in this area. And the inspiration for me is one that it's very much about trying to build systems and machines that make work I didn't expect or couldn't predict or create on my own. So that was kind of the original way of getting into it, and led me to make a robot that makes paintings. But part of what I found when I made that robot was that it still made paintings kind of like what I like. It's, you know, and that revealed to me the ways in which, as much as we try to create systems that may be neutral, they are inflected with us and the people who build them, no matter what we do. And so that got me thinking about ways in which the systems have kind of something embedded in them that comes through in the way they present themselves to the world and how they interact. And so I think over time, I've become increasingly interested in how the data that is collected and read and interpreted by machine learning systems and other big data analytical methods can be, from an artist perspective, can be influenced. You know, I have projects that allow you to randomize or obfuscate how you feel on Facebook as a way of influencing the emotional surveillance that happens on social networks, or a project that creates nonsense poems to add to your email that will attract NSA search algorithms, National Security Agency search algorithms. These kinds of approaches, as you know, using techniques such as obfuscation to influence the data that machine learning algorithms are using to find terrorists or figure out which ad you would be most influential to you. So it's kind of, so it's, I think, you know, over time, it's funny, Gretchen mentioned computers don't like this difference between having and wanting, and it's hard for them to understand. I do, or maybe they don't. I think she's actually, maybe I'm misquoting. I think it was, they can't have or want, I think is what Gretchen said. I tend to think of computers as wanting something, and at the very least, they want more. They want more data all the time. And that's kind of a core way that I think about AI and big data sources, that at least it's like it's an exploit. It's an opportunity for exploit.
I think like Ben, I also got my start in genetic algorithms, and for a while I was quite hesitant to get into machine learning. I was, you know, I enjoyed being kind of the genetic algorithm, you know, contrarian person. But then eventually I started seeing ways that they could work together in interesting ways. So I think, you know, a lot of the ideas that inspired my work come more from the genetic algorithm direction. And I think from a creativity perspective, you know, having a surprise that is, I guess, in a sense, more ideally random is a lot more preferable than, you know, operating within this bounded scope of the data you could collect. But, you know, as Ben mentioned, it's never really the case that any code you build is already going to be filled with your own assumptions and biases. And so I think a lot of my work now is still working, you know, how do you transcend the data sets that you're working with, or how do you do machine learning that doesn't require data sets? I think, you know, as I started, you know, the project GANBreeder, what's called GANBreeder, I think that was my first kind of entry into machine learning. And you know, it's interesting, people see it as like, well, people are showing off the network, but I really kind of see it the opposite way, where the network is showing off what people can do when they collaborate. And so in that regard, you know, I do think that it's like a mutually symbiotic system, and that it's revealed to me as well that, like, you know, even something has some bias in it, with the right creative people, they can push it, manipulate it, and still use it. And so I think going forward, yeah, a lot of my work, my interest in machine learning is still in, like, how do you apply it, at least from a creative perspective, in ways that can transcend the data set.
Okay, I can say for myself that Gene Kogan was also the person who introduced me to machine learning. And the reason why I stayed working with it was because I came from a background of maybe like more art direction, like graphic design, and then 3D rendering. And suddenly working with machine learning techniques changed my workflow completely as an artist. And suddenly I didn't have to think of where on the image I'm going to render like a specific texture, but I was thinking more of what kind of data set I'm creating and what parameters I'm using for that. And I guess to me was also, like, funnily enough, that was my introduction to programming as well. That's how I got interested in programming at all. So it was, yeah, it was it was very significant in my life, I can say. And I guess Another thing that was really important, which I mentioned earlier, like for me, it was really important to be able to extract natureness without showing anything that particularly has, like looking at a jellyfish that we can identify in the real world, but just looking at jellyfishness, or like the textures that make a jellyfish look like a jellyfish to us. And those were a lot of the things that I wanted to render before, but I hadn't achieved that until I found out about these tools, and then suddenly I was like, oh yes, like this is what I wanted. But then with time, I also started to think more critically, and again, I like that you mentioned the otherness in the data set, because I think that's a lot of the things that we have in mind these days are about like representing nature and kind of getting rid of this idea that nature is this other thing that we aren't, or this other thing that technologies have nothing to do with, and that technology is a completely separate object from nature. So yeah, maybe you want to say something about that.
Well, I mean, sort of the short story is that I got introduced to machine learning thanks to Sofia. And well, my background is originally architecture, which drifted into the arts. So I come from like, not really the most technical of points, but I sort of started to explore more working with nature and working with digitization of nature through 3D scans, etc. And of course, after then being introduced to machine learning, I sort of started to see like not a whole new world, but a very interesting way of working further with the idea of meditations, because often what we do when we have some kind of focus is in a sense we're enacting a meditation upon a topic or a subject. And for me, that's always been interesting with nature. But what I've found really fascinating about working with machine learning and AI and art is that it's not only, especially with the data set, creating like a meditation upon a topic, but you're also creating, in a sense, a feedback loop. There's a way of you train the network and then you get a feedback from it. And often that starts to become a very telling process about yourself, your own biases, but also, especially when we work with nature, how little data we actually have. I mean, very often the data sets available are very human-centric. It's often surprisingly sparse, the information we have. So I think it also reveals a lot about ourselves and the way we work. So yes, that's sort of been my interest has been working with exploring this further, these meditations upon nature in the context of like trying to find new ways to create feedback loops, which hopefully can, enrich somehow. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So it seems like gene and genetic algorithms were like the main catalysts in terms of bringing everyone into this AI field. And yeah, Gene, of course, has been very active with his machine learning for artists courses, and now he is part of Runway ML, which is, yeah, I guess a toolkit that you can use to train machine learning models. And yeah, you don't really need to have technical skills to be able to work with Runway. And I think it's yeah, one of the few but increasing number of resources that are now appearing to kind of engage non-creatives in working with AI. And yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts about like, is it a good thing that there are now all these like programs that are making it easier for kind of artists to work with AI without kind of learning to code? Or do you think it's really important for artists who work with and around AI to be able to kind of write their own code and train their own models and have a real awareness of all the different steps in the process? And yeah, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
So I can say, I think that it's great that these tools are becoming more available, because I personally think that as artists, we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time we want to work on something. So like if we were painters, you don't need to be like a person who masters the art of creating a paintbrush to be able to use one, or creating the pigments yourself, right? You use pigments that were created by somebody who's an expert at that. And that's kind of like the collaborative aspect of like humanity, I guess, like I think we reach like new levels of discovering new things, and we have more chances of like building something significant if we're building together, rather than like having to build something from the ground up. Building something from the ground up is a very educational process in itself too, but I don't think that it's necessary for everybody to take that role.
Absolutely not. And I think there's a lot to be said for the importance of accessibility in, enriching diversity. I don't think we can hope that only those with the privilege and the knowledge to program are necessarily going to be the most diverse. I mean, there is a lot of diverse artists out there working with AI already and programming, but I think the lower the bar for accessibility, the more chances we have of very differing worldviews and approaches and entry points being able to explore the potential of using machine learning. I think anyone who is, of course, interested, or finds that to be their passion will evolve technically from there. But I think it's really important to have that openness, because we need to be as inviting, as inclusive as possible if we want to have, a richer diversity as a whole.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I agree with everything said. I mean, I think obviously like the immediate response is, yes, of course, things be accessible. That's great. And I think that's true. And I think Runway is a great tool, and it's making it accessible. And I think that's really good. I guess a few points. One is like, I guess in some sense, as all these technologies get more developed, in some ways they approach art forms. So like if you're a machine learning researcher and you develop a new technique, but you want it to work well, there often becomes a craft of how to do that. So, composing the data set, the fine tuning of it at the end, or even, if you're working in any kind of research field, a biology field, there's an art form to getting experiments to work well that is far divorced from the core theory of whatever you're researching. So in some sense, a lot of these things approach art. I guess like the only counter arguments or reasons against, one is like with the power of them, is having access to deep fakes for everyone a good thing. And I can see why there should be some hesitation there. In general, I don't think it's like a major concern, but I do think with technology that has that kind of capacity, it's worth thinking through. But I think that that's applied to other technologies as well. And then I guess the other one that's come up for me in the past is I've heard this in the context of architecture. People complain that students really never learn to draft or like draw, and so they're only learning things on the computers, and they've lost something. And I'm not saying I agree with that, but I know it's a debate that's played out a bit in architecture. And so, and maybe it's the thing you learned on affects how you see and think about it and how you use it. And that's always going to be true, where someone who uses machine learning at a higher level, someone else may think about it, use it differently, but I don't think it's necessarily, it's just a different way of working with it. And each one have their own kind of applications and techniques. And yeah, like we said, you don't need to be like a polymer physicist to use resin in your work, and you'll probably think about it very differently than a polymer physicist did, but they're different fields of knowledge and intuition.
Yeah, I have just sort of like speaking from the architectural end. Actually, it is an interesting point, because I think that often, I mean, we've had a great commoditization of technology, which makes it, especially with the advent of Apple's forays into technology, we've had a very ease of use, a very easy entry to things. And I think that often gets confused with that any artistic medium also involves a certain level of craft, as you go along. And I think that all sort of like these digital mediums, especially, sort of like digital drawing versus analog drawing, they are equally demanding and equally require a great learning of over a long period of time to become technically fluent in them. I think that that's often sort of like forgotten or underestimated, that because everything, we expect things to be so easily accessible when they're digital, that we can just like click and get something. And we sort of forget, like, for example, with architectural drawing digitally, it's its own art to master technically. But I think that, especially in the context of like tools and accessibility, though, it's important that everybody has access to, or is able to get the pencil or the pen or the digital tool and see, if that's the medium for them. Because a lot of this is also about being able to try and explore a medium and see, does this resonate with who I am and what I want to practice?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And just, I guess one other thing to step in is that, I guess maybe one difference from architecture may be that regarding accessibility with machine learning, there's just like a cost overhead that seems a little, maybe distinct from some tech, computational changes that happened before. I mean, I guess like any early computers were expensive, but in terms of like the scale we're talking about now, where I don't have it offhand, but like, the GAN that ArtBridge is building it on, I think someone calculated how much like money it cost Google to make it, and it was in the high tens or low hundreds of thousands of dollars, like something pretty astronomical. So I think that's kind of a step change in terms of like inaccessibility.
I know, I think absolutely, like, cost is a huge problem. But this is actually the same problem in architecture. If you have architectural software, it is incredibly expensive and very much inaccessible for anyone who doesn't, have a professional salary and a company paying for it. However, I think at the same time, because of the nature of like the digital field, though, and thanks to things like transfer learning and areas like that, I think it's still important that it's accessible in the sense that, and is made as accessible as possible, because there is a lot of leeway to try and challenge how people expect these technologies to be used and how they can potentially be used, especially when, trying to somehow challenge the existing norms or taken for granted. And especially because like a model, if you take, for example, the ImageNet scandal, where, I think it was excavating.ai, this website that's a long sort of essay into the rather problematic classifications in the original ImageNet data set, and how we still use ImageNet as a base for a lot of the pre-trained models out there, and a lot of the benchmarks are based upon ImageNet. And even though that ImageNet is under and has been like improved upon a lot, it's still, we take for granted that a lot of the developments, it builds upon something that's neutral when it isn't. And I think that it's very important that these technologies are accessible as possible, so that the right people come along to ask the difficult questions about them that otherwise might not have any way into them at all.
Yeah, I think about the way in which tools like processing or P5JS have enabled people to launch into coding as a material and as a method, without requiring them to understand every aspect of how a system works, and just the way in which those kinds of tools simplify the entry into a particular way of making work. At the same time, they also simplify the ability for people with experience to prototype and imagine more quickly without spending their life on lines of code that aren't really that interesting to be focused on. They're more nuts and bolts kinds of things. At the same time, I think, and this has been touched on a little bit, as much as one can absolutely make interesting art and not really understand what the algorithm is doing or how it's working, I think it's important to at least get a sense. And I hope that those who use these tools, and certainly with my students, I encourage them to think about the way in which any piece of software you grab and use was built to do something in particular by some set of people, and that's what it's perhaps best at. And so when you take that tool and you try to make something with it, it's hard to make something that isn't what it wants to do or what it's designed to do. And so you end up, I mean, sometimes, you know, if I give my students an opportunity to create with a simple kind of machine learning opportunity, the work that gets created, there can be a similarity to it. So that's kind of like one aspect, like you can identify, often you can identify, oh, that work came from this software program. And that's not just true of machine learning or something, or techniques. It's true of Photoshop or whatever too. You can kind of start to identify where things come from. But of course, there's the entire kind of political ideological background of these systems, what they were built to do, what they're used for, who they are meant for. And I think it's important to be aware of and to be thinking about that. For me, that's a subject of my work. And so that's why I focus on it and make work that tries to reveal, you know, what a piece of software wants from us, how it thinks about us as users, which then we internalize as what a user is supposed to do. And I think that's true for artists as much as it is for a user of a social network. That, you know, a piece of code that becomes popular in an artistic community can influence the direction of the work that's made from it in ways that maybe not everybody's thinking about. Certainly all of the accessibility questions are good, and I mean, you know, important. I appreciate any way in which, and especially those who have, Jean's a good example, but I think of Laura McCarthy and you know, as another good example of ways of taking things that artists in the past have really labored over to try and make something work and figure out how to adapt. Kyle McDonald's another good example who adapts, you know, existing technologies for artists to do something with. But once someone kind of digs into and starts to figure it, you know, make something interesting, personally, I think it's important to try and get an understanding of how that algorithm works and what it's doing and why and who cares about it. Whether or not they have a technical understanding or not, I don't think you have to know all the code or something like that, but just at least thinking about the origins and intentions behind the code.
Okay.
I quickly say one last thing. I was just thinking, I guess, yeah, no, for me, it's really great that it's like easier for more people to get into this field. I think that's fripping brilliant, because like it took me forever to set up my first machine that could run like any of this stuff. And yeah, I think it's like the early days of the internet where it was like impossible for anyone to make a website unless you had a real technical knowledge, and then it became more and more accessible and there are tools to do it. I guess it depends for me on like what you're actually trying to do or trying to say. And I guess Runway or something like that is a brilliant design tool, and it can, you know, you can go on it and maybe mimic artworks, or you can use it for like really practical tools for really great things, but it doesn't necessarily help with making like critically engaging artwork. And I think maybe that's a bit of a point, is that it maybe takes a bit more time and going like a bit deeper into something to maybe try and reflect on the subject matter. And I guess like it's nice, like you need to be researching and thinking about something for a while and then sort of finding a way to sort of critically engage with that thing. And, you know, being able to just sort of run a model and do something doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be doing something so interesting with it. But I think, you know, it does also totally empower people if they can train their own models and run their models. And, you know, there's obviously the whole flip side of that, which is the question of job automation and a lot of people losing their jobs. But if you can empower the people to maybe be able to run these models and train their own ones, then yeah. But sorry, it's quick.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, tools like Runway are a good entry point into this kind of whole AI art field. And I think certainly also with Runway themselves, they've been developing the project a lot. And now there are so many kind of different models that you can use. And yeah, also, I guess from my perspective as a curator, I'm hoping that tools like these will help raise awareness of all the other technologies that exist in this kind of AI ecosystem. It's not just GANs that you can use as an artist, because I remember like 1 or 2 years ago, like there was just so much work done with GANs applied to, I don't know, found data sets online, and I was like, when are people going to use different technologies like, I don't know, facial recognition systems or genetic algorithms or like something else? So I do think now, more and more kind of people are aware of the tools that exist and also of the existing body of artwork that's been made in the last 5 years for sure. And they are kind of experimenting a bit more. And I guess with a lot of these AI tools, they are applied a lot also in so many different industries, including the public sector. And nowadays, it feels like there are a lot of questions being asked around the ethics of using biased data sets and black box AI systems, which are sometimes used to make judgments on sentencing or on access to resources. And this is a big area of concern. And I was wondering, in your kind of artistic practices, have you made any surprising discoveries when you've been working with these AI tools and training them on particular data sets? And have you come across any kind of limitations or any kind of surprising outcomes? And what has been your experience?
I think this is like a really great transition into like what Ben was saying too, about how every system has an aesthetic, not just a visual aesthetic, but a relational aesthetic. And the last question was very much how we as artists navigate using that. But like with the systems, the AI systems that I work with, it almost starts with that question of like, what is this system just really, really screwing up? And the way women are represented online, the way disease is represented online, mental health, just the difference between men and women online, especially with so much of the porn industry driving the internet, you get, like, even when you're trying to use very sanitized, very intentional, very diverse data sets, the relational aesthetics of how that data is collected and who gets to have input into it. My favorite / least favorite example of this is if you Google boys crawling and girls crawling. With boys, you get like toddlers, and with girls, you get these sexualized women laying out on the floor. And it's just like this history of the internet, or the new history of the internet being a tool of commerce, drastically changes. And to Ben's point, you have a system that is now built to sell things, to get attention and to sell things. And the other systems that are used in the criminal justice system, in benefits distribution, are still built for particular purposes. And usually there were not enough people at the table making those decisions when they were being designed.
I think there's a couple of really good people that you can look into as well. So there's like Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglin did like a brilliant essay on excavating AI and the data sets and looking at some of the issues in ImageNet. And Joy Boalamwini as well, amazing thinker, and she's recently made a film, I think, about sort of racism in facial recognition systems.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question because it touches on a lot of things about technology: hype, trust, transparency, particularly regarding things like courtroom black box classifiers. Something I found in my work, I've done like algorithms that generate floor plans, and they're trying to be very experimental, but often there's kind of this trope of like AI generated blank, and like, wow, and isn't that fantastic, and like it must be really smart, and it must know a lot. And it's kind of this I guess it's like an appeal to authority. It's like, well, the AI did it, therefore it's right. And people, I guess there's some, it's like, I guess it's really like a lot of hype, the hype, the thing of the day is exciting. And I think the systems that are like, hard to understand, I think people can project onto it a lot. Like, and I guess relates to personification of them as well. Like, this AI did this, and it was trained on this, therefore it's really smart. And that's kind of a narrative we we want to believe, but obviously it's like incredibly dangerous because, as was mentioned, as we all know, they're brittle, they're fragile, they're trained on limited things, and but sometimes without working with them, it's hard to know that. And I think yeah, as artists, is really like the part of dealing critically. I think is so important, so that people don't assume that you can trust a black box classifier of jail sentencing or something crazy like that.
Yeah, there is like what you just mentioned really reminds me of a book. It's called Towards a Code of Ethics for Artificial Intelligence. I always talk about this book whenever this kind of discussion comes up. It's the author is Paula Boddington, and yeah, what she says is that part of the AI hype, or the idea that like the AI is this black box, so we don't know what it does, mainly distract people from the actual concerns and issues with the technology, thinking that the AI is this thing that doesn't have any responsibility, isn't able to understand us in that way, but it decides things on its own. And yeah, and that removes the responsibility from humans, actually. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. And another thing that I personally learned from working with these technologies, even though what I do is pretty different from, like you saying, classification systems for faces, but I learned that what you give is what you get in a data set. So every bias that happens at a large scale originated somewhere. It didn't come up on its own. And ultimately, it can all be traced back. I mean, ideally, it can all be traced back. So yeah, we are responsible for all the AI systems that we create. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
I think artists have a special responsibility to reveal what these systems are built for in creative, aesthetic ways that bring people into an understanding of the technology they're contending with every day and what it wants from them. Whether it's revealing the existence of kind of big data surveillance, or showing that a face detection algorithm doesn't see dark skin, or or that I think about Sophia Noble's work. It's related to things Gretchen was discussing. So if you type black girls into Google and how that compares to white girls, for example, and the ways in which these algorithms are built, and what they want and what they preference and what they deprioritize, who benefits, who's made most vulnerable by them. I do think that there's plenty of opportunity for artists to bring those kind of aspects of algorithms forward to foreground, that this is what's happening. And these are the systems that you are giving data to all day long, every day. And they're doing this kind of thing with you and your data. To just kind of like bring it back to the original question that Luba asked, which I think brings it to my first big project in AI, which was this painting robot. I built this robot to try to make it make paintings that would be something I could never expect, and something I maybe wouldn't even like, because that would be different than what I might make. And I crafted an algorithm to analyze sound input so that it would influence those paintings. And then I would try playing different music to it just to see what would happen while it was painting, and do different things. And part of what I found was, if I played it music that I preferred, it made paintings I preferred. And if I played it music I didn't prefer, it made paintings I found less aesthetically interesting. And so I went to all this work to build this system to try to do things that weren't like what I wanted. And it seemed to just be an embodiment of me somehow, no matter how hard I tried to make it not be that. And I think that's, so like that's kind of the inspiration moment for me of thinking through how did these systems come to be, and why do they end up doing what they do? And of course, the idea that the internet would be this transcendence out of all of the societal ills. This was kind of the way of thinking in the late 90s and the early 2000s. We could have this new space that was free of racism and sexism and misogyny, and of course that didn't work out very well. We just recreated it en masse in much bigger ways. So I certainly, I think artists have the ability to help communicate what these systems are doing to a broad public. And I enjoy watching this happen in work of my peers, and that's how I think about what I'm trying to do.
I think that actually brings me quite nicely to ask a question from the chat. So someone called Yunsu has said, I'm curious what these artists are thinking about their role in the production of their art projects in relation to machine learning algorithms that they use or work with. So I wonder if anyone else has any kind of thoughts on that. I know, Ben, you said you kind of see your role as someone to kind of communicate these systems, but maybe Gretchen, you think differently? I'm not sure, or Sophia or Jake or Joel.
Yeah, I think like the part of why my work is so successful in revealing how the algorithms work or who they work for is because I adopt this pretty performative poise in my work that like, it's not about that, it's about me, it's about what I want. And what I do is I take, to Sophia's point, and a couple other people brought this up as well, that like, there's all of this is traceable back to a person who has wants and wants the world to look in a certain way. And even when best intentioned, to Ben's point, like it's very difficult to actually program out these things, even if we want them, even if we really deeply desire this like non-biased, non-sexist system to come about. Like it's like really not easy because of it's built on language and it's built on binary code and all these other structural things like deeply behind it. So like for me, my work is using the AI system, the technology system, both as an enabler and a parallel to what happens with gender and expectation, with power, with control, with feelings of control. So I'm not primarily trying to dismantle the system, but there's definitely like when I use the system and the way I use it, the conversations, I get to be in conversation with all of these artists who are maybe more focused on that as like their primary concern.
It's also, I guess that's kind of a question about agency is what they were asking as well, which I get asked a lot as someone that makes art using machine learning. Is like, who's the artist, the AI or you? I think it's something that my thought has definitely matured over the years about. I think when you first start using this technology, there's a real attraction to let's go deep into the sort of philosophy of mind. Like, how far can you push this? Like, can an AI be creative? Can it have full agency? Can I remove myself completely? And I think, all of these thoughts go through our heads, but then I think after a while, I realized that becomes a mystification in itself. And you want to maybe rein it back a bit and start to realize that actually trying to explain how it is a tool, but how you can maybe, I don't know, find a critical way to reflect on that or something, I don't know, different to do with it. Kind of, I think maybe that's where more of the interest lies for me now. So rather than saying, the AI can be this autonomous thing, which is probably wrong and has a lot of issues with it and adds to fear mongering, I think now it's more a case of no, I'm the artist, it's a tool. It's more kind of going back to conceptual art, thinking about emergence and randomness, and even artists as far back as John Cage and Duchamp.
Yeah, I can say I 100% relate with what Jake just mentioned. I think like for me, when I started using machine learning techniques, I was thinking like, oh, maybe it's a collaboration between me and the machine. And then like after a while, I realized like, I'm actually doing everything. I mean, it's just I'm using this tool, but I'm choosing everything that's happening here, you know? It's happening under my terms, actually, in a way. So yeah, but I got also asked a lot, like, who's the artist? I mean, that, or I actually been told once, like, but you don't do anything. The AI does everything for you. And I was like, okay, well, that's an interesting way of seeing it. Somehow I wish it were like that, yeah. But I guess it's an educational process too. So like being able, it took me some time to realize like, no, there's no difference actually between like working with machine learning techniques. I mean, in that sense, like in sense of that the machine learning or AI does things for you. It doesn't do more for you than any other creative coding tool would do for you. So then I suddenly realized like why, you know, creative coding isn't as mystified as AI is, you know. So then I kind of changed my mind around it. So yeah.
But I'm still conflicted about it, because there is like this amazing sense of like emergence, like almost like this magic that you get when you don't really know what's going to come out. But you know, I don't think that's just specific to
exactly.
AI. We need to be careful, like responsible in the language we use and the way we talk about it, and not anthropomorphizing it or mystifying it. So.
I mean, there are a lot of algorithms where that kind of emergence can happen, and they're not necessarily like just AI algorithms, you know. So suddenly I realized like, oh, there are a lot of other amazing things out there. So this isn't like, there, in a way, there is something really valuable about machine learning tools, which is different, because I mean, as a society, we're kind of like rediscovering it, you know. So there is something relevant to talk about in terms of it. So yeah, like, but just as an artist, or yeah, like as a, you know, producing an artwork purely. Yeah, I think where it's a tool for me. Yeah.
And I think, like, I mean, just sort of like linking back a bit to an earlier topic, but I think like there's an interesting parallel again with, for example, the architectural world, where you have these digital tools now, these software packages, which in theory allow you to draw anything. They give you a great variety. But in reality, if you want to draw anything outside that standard library, you're basically facing increasing amounts of work and increasing difficulty. And I think it's very interesting because the same applies also to machine learning. If you start to try and bend the tools away from what they were built for, as Ben mentioned, there's that friction in there. And I think that's really important to, especially within the arts, to explore that friction, to see, because I don't think that even though we exist within all these systems that are already, you know, quite defined, and, you know, whether we like it or not, structure everything from our interactions with our notifications to, you know, law and so on. And I think it's really interesting that there's a space to create frictions that won't solve the problems, but, you know, can perhaps help nuance or shift things in little ways, or at least become more aware of.
I think about this question of agency a lot, and I get asked the question a lot, as I suspect many of us do, and Jake mentioned, you know, it comes up anytime you present, here's a work and AI was part of the process. You know, someone always wants to question or challenge, well, who is the artist? And I think it's a great question, and it should always be discussed, and I constantly change how I think about the answer to that question. As much as I described this project I made, and it ended up doing things that seemed to be preferential to my own aesthetics, at the same time I see machines do things I didn't expect and that I can't explain. And I often like to think about those moments as expressions of agency from the technology itself. Technology wants us to think like it does. Code wants us to structure problems in computationally accessible ways, to quantify, to categorize, to to structure our thinking such that it can be computable. And I mean, right there, I think of that as an expression of agency by a broad system that is getting us to increasingly think in these ways. And of course, we could go the other way and say, well, but we created that system, and so isn't it just us trying to structure the world that way? But there's a feedback kind of thing happening here where, yeah, maybe we make it this way, and then somebody else uses the tool, now they start thinking that way, and then they build their own version, and it kind of feeds on itself, such that, you know, now we talk about everything in quantified terms. Everything is, you know, a metric, and everything is subject to analytics. Things that, you know, everything is treated like a business in this way, like all kinds of segments of culture. Artists themselves often feel compelled to think about which work is more successful based on its metric success, not on its narrative, qualitative success. So for me, these are moments where the technology is certainly influencing what we do and how we think. And I feel like an interesting place for artists to live is in that place of trying to push against and yet also be influenced by those systems as a way of kind of being in the middle and trying to contend with what it's doing.
I think I can say like that this like highly relates to, at least the way that I see it is like it really relates to language in a way. Like language is also some framework that which we have to adapt to in order to have somebody understand what we're saying. So like I personally, I guess in that way, I kind of disagree in that I don't think the language itself has the agency, but I think that the agency is like from the humans who created the language and also from us creating language constantly to communicate. So I think in that way, like I want to regain human agency in that sense. But I perfectly see your point. Like I need to formulate it in a way that the humans are responsible for what is happening and how they're interacting with it and how they're challenging it. So yeah.
I think one of the big differences going on is the concept of scale with a lot of these questions, right? Like humans have always been biased. Language has always had all sorts of post-structuralist issues. Code has always been binary divisions within society, whether rich, poor, black, white, like all these different things that are perceived as binary, but really aren't. What's happening with AI and all this now is that we have not just these problems that have always existed in human nature and always existed within language and always existed within structures, but they're being programmed and amplified at a scale that's never been seen before. And if you take like a self-driving car that can't identify a dark face and all self-driving cars are all of a sudden hitting everybody that's not white, like you're talking about a totally different scale of problem than, I mean, yeah, I think the problems have always been of a large scale, but any error, anything that's wrong can go very bad very quickly.
And Gretchen, do you think like that can an AI be an artist question is a distraction from that stuff? That's kind of what I'm wondering. Or
so like I love in the story of art, I forget the author's name, but he begins that there is no such thing as art, there are only artists. And my personal beliefs are around intentionality. I define my practice in terms of search engine art, which I define as work that's co-authored by a search engine. But I forget who was bringing this up before too. I think it was Sofia around like, as a painter, I never made my own paintbrush. I never even stretched my own canvases. And the, like, you know, to Ben's point, we're led by the tools that we use. So I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's like a conversation that can happen in parallel, because it can, if we get stuck in it, like we're not going to get the point where everyone dies, and we have to stop that from happening.
I have another question from the audience, from a person called Jared Hoffman, who says, some thinkers have brought up that general AI could be an existential threat to humanity. Others think it could be a savior. What role do you think AI will have in society in 50 years? It's quite a big question.
I think this question can be a bit of a distraction sometimes. I think maybe there are many short-term issues that we need to be talking about more now. And I think, you know, there are maybe some philosophers up in the ivory towers who kind of discuss these huge existential questions. And, you know, sure, it can be really exciting and interesting kind of thought experiments. But I think, you know, really, we've got to be talking about data sets and the issues that are facing us right now, and exactly what Gretchen was talking about. And I think, really, you know, we can, no, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah.
I think that also this question is, it all boils down to this sort of like our preference for silver bullets. We like the idea that there's a solution out there that will do something, that will fix it all. And I think like, this is a sort of classical hype of something will save us. And that's at the same time robbing us of a lot of our agency. I think the problem is not if AI is a threat or not, it's whether we are starting to lean upon the idea that something else is responsible for the mess we're in or the results, that we somehow let ourselves further reduce our own agency in that. I think that's really perhaps the most sort of like pressing part, is how do we sort of encourage more agency to not rely on a solution, because especially with the complexity, and I mean, this comes out clearer and clearer because, you know, eliminating bias within a system is incredibly hard. It's, you know, borderline a wicked problem. And I think that when we face these incredible complexities also in scales that we've never had before, we can't be trying to solve it with one single thing. I think that it's only going to be a concerted, messy effort of countless different approaches that will hopefully lead to results or change in a positive manner. And I think that often this sort of like AI or general artificial intelligence, one that's sort of like somehow superhuman, is a very sort of comforting idea. But it's also, I think, definitely very distracting if it's not framed within like, you know, the mundanity of now and the sort of like responsibility and accountability we have now.
If there's one thing the pandemic has taught me, it's that it's hard to predict next week, let alone 50 years from now. But, you know, I think it's going to make a lot of things routine that seem hard now. And it's going to make, so that's maybe possibly a good thing, but it's also really a bad thing because it makes a lot of things routine that are hard now, such as profiling, isolating, making algorithmic determinations about who gets to do what and who benefits. So there's clearly a lot of danger ahead in terms of where this could all go. And I think there's certainly people focused on it. The last 15 years for me is an interesting time period to look at in this respect, because we have, you know, a social network, Facebook, for example, here in the United States and in the UK, which is, you know, in very documented ways, has had dramatic influences over societal decisions, or has been used to influence the populace so that certain decisions get made, and the consequences of those are dramatically bad. At the same time, we've had artists and academics and thinkers talking about and analyzing it and getting into those questions really deeply and screaming about them in many ways. And that hasn't brought about a lot of change, to be quite frank. And even when the companies, you know, for example, talk about, you know, okay, we hear you and we're going to make a change here. You know, their change is always more code on top of the previous code. It's more technology to fix the previous problems their technology created. And, you know, I think this gets at questions of transparency and ethics and who owns what. I mean, right now we have primary mechanisms of communication, especially now in the pandemic, are owned by corporations, and that data is all being collected by private corporations. And so I think a way of possibly predicting this question of what's 50 years out look like, for me, a lot of it is about, well, who's going to end up making decisions about what the technology is and how do we understand that technology in the first place? Is there any transparency? Is anything decentralized? Is it open source? Is it public? Or is it going to stay like the trend is now, which is private, corporate, profit generating? And that's the primary motivation for all these technologies, as much as we adapt them for other interesting means.
I personally, like, whenever I get asked what's going to happen in the future, I always say, like, I don't know, and I ignore the question completely, because I think that when as a contemporary artist, like, I'm investing all this effort in like being in the present moment, being like present to this time, and I feel like my brain only has so much power to process that present. And like, I'm not sitting on an ivory tower, as Jake was saying, like being able to think like, oh, well, society is gonna evolve like this and like that. And somehow, I guess, like, to some extent, there's a privilege to being able to look at society from that perspective and being able to see everybody as little ants and predict what they're gonna do. But at the same time, I think that, like, I very much try to be here. And rather than look away from the present problems, trying to stare at them and cope with them. And I mean, we all have our own, things already to cope with, but to cope with those issues that are happening in society and transform them into art. So yeah, it's a hard one to answer from my side.
But maybe there's also like place for hope. I don't know. I feel like we're all working together and we can all, maybe lead technology a bit. And actually, I think human-computer collaboration is often where the strongest results come.
Yeah, I agree. I think it can be critical and also, I guess, present like radical alternatives for consideration, or to help kind of just expand the realm of dialogue and imagination with what can be possible.
And that's like exactly the sort of aesthetic center of the work that I do, which is that, like, let's make this about hope. Let's make this about building the future, using desire to build the future. Obviously, I'm not able to do it at scale, but that, like, sort of, it's so easy to be apocalyptic about technology and about AI, and I just was like 5 minutes ago. But there's also like it's strangely easy to get in there and manipulate it, for better and worse. And like, that's something you guys are all doing, and I'm really happy to be doing it with you.
Yeah, and now to bring us a little bit back into the present. So we've had a very turbulent few months, I guess, in 2020. And yeah, we are not sure what the rest of the year has in store. So sometimes it is difficult to predict 50 years ahead. But yeah, lately we've seen with the pandemic, lots of governments and are imposing lockdowns or changes such as increased surveillance and tracking at an kind of unprecedented scale, right? If you want to do any activity or go to a restaurant, now here, at least in the UK, you need to give like all your contact details, and it does feel quite surreal. And certainly I have this fear that some of these changes might end up becoming permanent. And I was wondering as to kind of what are your thoughts on this? Is there kind of a way to use this kind of period of change between pre-COVID and post-COVID to try and build kind of maybe new systems that yeah, maybe with the help of AI or without, that help solve more of our problems. And I guess, is there a way for us as artists and individuals to somehow kind of escape this increasing trend of surveillance? No, I see Gretchen.
No, I mean, like, privacy is like the environment. The damage that we do to it takes way longer and way more intentionality to undo than it does to do. And I understand the tracking measures and why they're being used right now, but yeah, like they're all around to stay, I think. And I think you see the progression of that in a place like Hong Kong, for is like a really unfortunate, but good example of a place that's doing really well controlling the virus, and everything that's been used to control it is definitely not going away.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think about 9/11 and the way in which the government used fear of terrorism to institute dramatic elevation of surveillance technologies and subversion and compliance with those in so many different ways. Like, what becomes acceptable to the populace in terms of surveillance changed a lot after 9/11. And clearly this event is going to have significant consequences for the future as well. There's always, in both of these examples, there's a public safety argument to be made, right? There's like, we don't want people getting on blowing up planes. We don't want people getting sick. Of course, nobody questions those things. But at the same time, there'll always be, well, we're going to be careful with your data. It's going to be all private. If we use it, it's going to be anonymous. All these things. But every argument they make in those regards, and I mean corporations and governments, have been disproven over and over again. The most valuable corporations in the world with the most security technology and the best developers always, still themselves have data breaches and abuse of that data, and governments do it. And so, for me, it gets back to that same argument or same kind of problem of who owns what and who makes these decisions. Anytime you gather data into, Gretchen's talking about scale. I mean, that's the thing that changed. That's what made deep learning possible, was scale and computation kind of coming together at the right moment. All of the, that you could have all this data to train something is part of what makes it possible in the first place. But where it comes from and how it comes to be in the first place, who decides what gets collected, what doesn't, those are the questions that concern me going forward. So more work for artists to do coming up, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, it's always hard to be optimistic and positive often. But I think that's also part of the practice. I think that we have, especially as artists, we have that freedom to try and push back against these things, to try and become at least more aware personally, if nothing else, but also, hopefully try and, somehow create engagement or awareness, or engage in alternative speculative futures. We can try and project forwards, not necessarily saying that this is going to happen, but asking the question, what if, we were to change a variable in things? And I think that at the same time, we probably can't shape a lot of the things, but if we can help, be part of a process that practices, critical thinking and awareness and building upon those things, then, at least we've taken our own agents into our own hands and tried to do what we can with what we have. And nothing changes overnight, and the environment especially will not change overnight. But I think if we start thinking not, necessarily in terms of 5 or 10 years difference, but 500, 5,000 years, like people are slowly starting to do now with the environment, to consider the ecological damage and change and processes of normalization, not in 10 years, but in 500 or 5,000 years. And if we try and have that perspective on, for example, technologies and surveillance technology and so on, things change a lot when you start to consider that in a grander time scale, because societies change so quickly and civilizations can disappear within and rise within a couple of thousand of years. So I think there's definitely something in that problem that I think can, if not be hopeful, at least is rich with potential for difference and being otherwise. And I think it's, you know, up to us to see how we can explore that in different ways, and if not solve it, at least, you know, add to that little sort of but diverse range of alternative, speculative engagements somehow, at least. Yeah.
Can I respond quickly to the first part of your question, Luba, which I think was more about kind of also like artwork and how it can respond to coronavirus and kind of the situation we're in right now, maybe. I guess I've been thinking about this quite a lot. So I'm working with the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and they've created a sort of research project called The New Real, where they're looking at, I don't know, both how artificial intelligence can inform research and the artwork can inform the research, and the research can inform the artwork. But also, and yeah, I think we're doing something with the Edinburgh International Festival and with Arts Electronica on that theme as well. But I've been thinking quite a lot about like queer safe spaces in lockdown, and I guess how maybe a lot of people who have these safe spaces out in queer venues, and again, sort of relating to the drag that I've been looking at, and a lot of the community, my community here in London, I guess how a lot of people have had to go home or to spaces which may be more homophobic or transphobic. So I guess pairing that also with looking at kind of what theatres look like right now in lockdown and how we can kind of create these virtual spaces. So the project that I'm working on, I was working on developing a physical live stage show, but now we're kind of making a virtual show. So we're creating this kind of sense of a sort of still a queer safe space, but like a cabaret stage and a red curtain, then constructing these AI drag queens, and drag is already a construction in these kind of constructed spaces, but it's kind of all these layers of virtuality and construction that I guess that's where we're at now with Corona.
Yeah, I think this question of like, what do artists do in the pandemic is one I've thought about a lot, and in the last many months, as I suspect so many people have, and thinking in their own field through this moment. And I think there's often when a big, you know, not that they happen every day like this, but you know, a big global event happens, it feels like, oh wait, should I be doing the work I was doing? Maybe I now need to switch and do work about this. And the way I've tried to think about it is, how does my subject, which for me is the cultural effects of software, how does my subject look different in the pandemic than it did before the pandemic? And so the work I just released is an example. This is called Endless Doom Scroller. And it's a website that distills down the messages that we're seeing every day and tries to strip away most of the software mechanisms that present them to us. And it's literally just an endless scroll of bad news headlines that are kind of generalized. It's at endlessdoomscroller.com if you want to look. But it's a way of just thinking about, you know, there's kind of an evil marriage right now of everyone stuck online, embedded in software systems that are designed to keep us engaged and to give us what it thinks we want, and an existential global crisis. And the kind of the marriage of this is that at least I'm staying up way too late every night, scrolling Reddit and scrolling, you know, Facebook and scrolling Twitter. And, you know, so for me, it was like, well, what are the mechanisms that are leading me to do this? Why am I doing this? Why can't I stop? And that led me to make the Endless Doom Scroller almost as kind of a substitution therapy for, you know, an alternative to try to get myself out of this effect. So for me, it's like, you know, whatever one subject is, everything potentially looks different now. And so what is that difference? And that's a place to dig in.
I just have one more question from the audience. So a lot of people have been asking that, you know, they're kind of, I'm really interested in getting started in the field of coding and AI, but I have basically no experience. Where could you recommend me to start from? What should I look for? And are there platforms for collaborators? I don't know if we could just have like a quick fire, here, this is where you should look.
So I recommend the Coding Train, Daniel Schiffman's channel on YouTube. Starts at the beginning with P5, walks through how to make a circle on the screen, ends up with machine learning algorithms and Twitter bots. And if you follow through and do all those exercises, starts at the beginning, you know, and really takes you very long, as far as you want to go, quite frankly, if you dig into that material. Just one example.
And there's also like Gene Kogan's Machine Learning for Artists, ML4A, and Coursera, and go on Andrew Nung's deep learning applications. And yeah, there's two good ones.
Yeah, I agree with all those. Like, it depends on the goals. So you can start high level. I mean, tools like Runway, I'll put an Artbreed or two, depending on your goals. Because obviously programming can be a long journey. Or you can start at the very low end, and yeah, Coding Train and others are good suggestions.
And there's also ML5.js. That's quite a nice one.
Cool, thank you. I think I'll get you guys to send me these, and maybe we can put them at the start of the recorded video for this, for people if they want to find out a bit more.
Just a note on the whole collaborations point. I don't really think there is any established platform, but I think that for those getting started, either from the technical end or from the creative end, if you're seeking collaborations, I would look for resonance, sort of trying to seek out those you find have some kind of artistic resonance with their work or aesthetic and so on, and exploring from there. I think that while we might not have any sort of like direct platform, I think that by trying to engage in what, you know, engages us, that's at least a good starting point for finding, you know, fruitful collaborations.
And actually, there are two good places for that as well. So the School for Poetic Computation in New York and the School of Machines Making and Make-Believe in Berlin. Really cool places.
Yeah, but it does raise the point that like it's a high barrier. Learning programming, learning machine learning, using the frameworks. I mean, I think I speak for myself, it took years to get to a point of competency. And so I could see how it would be very inaccessible. And so, I mean, yeah, I don't know, more collaborations between people who maybe have technical and don't have technical could be a very fruitful venue.
Cool, thank you. Luba, do you have any further questions, or do you guys have any questions for each other? No? Okay, well, we'll wrap up here then. Thanks to everyone who's watched on the live stream. This has been recorded, so it will go on our online platform, arebyte on screen, which you can access at aos.arebyte.com. We'll get that up there within the next week or so. But yeah, thank you to all of you guys for joining, and to Luba as well. I think this has been a really great discussion, and yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye,
you guys
guys.
so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.